No doubt you've heard of the fairy tale The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen. First published in 1845, it tells the story of a young match seller, shivering and shoeless, struggling on freezing streets against the cold to sell enough matches to avoid the wrath of her father. Lighting her matches for warmth, she briefly imagined scenes of happiness before her, plentiful food and the love of her grandmother, before the last match extinguishes itself to rob her of her dreams and her life in the perishing temperature. Andersen's story is a sombre narrative and yet a bleak reminder that the harsh life of a match seller wasn't mere fantasy, but a cruel reality of life for the poor on the streets in the 19th century. In a world of few labour laws, child workers were an everyday feature of Victorian trade, and could often be found selling wares on the streets. Sellers could be helping to support a family or keeping an intemperate parent in drink. Neglected children and destitute women often took to the streets to sell matches, and sometimes their boxes were mere props for begging, merely pretending to offer for sale the few battered boxes of matches they held in their hands as an excuse for asking for pence. A reasonable profit could be made from match selling by buying wasters or imperfect matches directly from the East End factories that produced them. These might not flame readily, but were good enough to be traded on the street, and so those with a little money to buy in bulk could benefit by selling them cheaply. The matchmakers worked in horrendously dangerous conditions in these factories, and theirs is a different story. Many passed through the hands of intermediary dealers, and the poorest match sellers obtained their boxes from them. But they probably sold anything that was cheap enough to obtain and pay best on the day, be it candle ends or bootlaces one day and matches the next. Today, we look at the life of match sellers according to the account of the Victorian journalist Henry Mayhew, writing about London's poor and their labour in the 1840s. He observed the lives of the working classes and interviewed many of them, providing us with a genuine and fascinating account of what for many was a wretched existence and daily struggle to survive. Before we move on, please consider clicking the subscribe button for more content like this. If you find this video interesting, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up and share it widely with friends and family. You can also support the channel and get access to exclusive perks by becoming a channel member. Check out the Join button and description for more. The children of the poor, often street traders themselves, are sent out onto the streets as soon as they could understand a farthing from a penny, for they must help. One poor woman who made a scanty living in working on corn sacks and bags, her infirmities sometimes preventing her working at all, sent out 3 children, together or separately, to sell lucifer matches or small wares.
"I like it," she said, "and always want to be off into the streets. And when my husband,
a labourer,
was ill in the hospital, the few pence they brought in was very useful. But now he's well and at work again, and we want to send the eldest, she's 9, to school. But they all will go out to sell if they can get hold of any stock. I would never have sent them at all if I could have helped it. But if they made 6 pence a day among the 3 of them, perhaps it saved their lives when things were at the worst."
If a poor woman, as in this instance, has not been used to street selling herself, there is always some neighbour to advise her what to purchase for her children's hawking and instruct her where. Until lucifers became cheap and in general use, the matches sold by the street folks, and there were numbers in the trade, were usually prepared by themselves. The manufactures were simple enough. Wooden splints, twice or thrice the length of the lucifer matches now in use, were prepared and dipped into brimstone, melted in an iron ladle. The matches were never, as now, self-igniting, or rather ignitable by rapid friction, but it was necessary to strike a light by the concussion of a flint and steel, the sparks from which were communicated to tinder, kept in a box. The brimstone match sellers were of all ages, but principally, I am told, old people. Many of them during, and for some years after the war, wore tattered regimentals, or some remains of military paraphernalia, and had been, or assumed to have been, soldiers, but not entitled to a pension. The same with seamen. I inquired of some of the present race of match sellers what became of the old brimstones, as I heard them called, but from them I could gain little information. An old groundsel gatherer told me that some went into his trade, others, I learned, took to pins, and others to song or tract selling. Indeed, the brimstone match sellers not unfrequently carried a few songs to vend with their matches. It must be borne in mind that 15 years ago, those street trades, into which anyone who is master of a few pence can now embark, were less numerous. Others of the match sellers, with rounds or being known men, displaced their brimstones for lucifers, and traded on as usual. I heard of one old man, now dead, who made a living on brimstone matches by selling a good quantity in Hackney, Stoke Newington, and Islington, and who long refused to sell lucifer matches.
"They was new-fangled rubbish,"
he said,
"and would soon have their day."
He found his customers, however, fall off, and in apprehension of losing them all, he was compelled to move with the times.
"Oh, I believe, sir,"
said one man, still a street seller, but not having sold matches of any kind for years,
"I believe I was the first who hawked Congreves, or instantaneous lights. They weren't called lucifers for a good while after. I bought them at Mr. Jones's lighthouse in the Strand, and if I remember right, for it must be more than 20 years ago, between 1820 and 1830, Mr. Jones had a patent somehow about them. I bought them at 7 shillings a dozen boxes, and sold them at 1 shilling a box. I'm not sure how many matches was in a box, but I think it was 100. You'll get as much for a farthing now as you would for a shilling then. The matches were lighted by being drawn quickly through sandpaper. I sold them for a 12-month, and had the trade all to myself, as far as I know, I had, for I never met with or heard of anybody else in it all that time. I did decent at it. I suppose I cleared me 15 shillings a week. The price kept the same while I was in the business. I sold them at city offices. I supplied the Phoenix in Lombard Street, I remember, and the better sort of shops. People liked them when they wanted to light a candle in a hurry, in places where there was no fire to seal a letter, or such like. There was no envelopes in them days. The penny postage brought them in. I was sometimes told not to carry such things there again. As they didn't want the house set on fire by keeping such dangerous things in it. No, I suppose, lucifers are in every house, and that there's not a tinderbox used in all London.
Such appears to have been the beginning of the extensive street trade in these chemical preparations now carried on. At the 12 months' end, my informant went into another line of business. The German Congreves were soon after introduced, and were at first sold wholesale at the English and German swag shops in Houndsditch at 2 shillings the dozen boxes, and were retailed at 3 pence, 4 pence, and sometimes as high as 6 pence the box. These matches, I am told, kept their hold about 5 years, when they ceased to be a portion of the street trade. The German Congreves were ignited by being drawn along a slip of sandpaper at the bottom of the box, as is done at present. With some, however, a double piece of sandpaper was sold for purposes of igniting. After this time, cheaper and cheaper matches were introduced, and were sold in the streets immediately on their introduction. At first, the cheaper matches had an unpleasant smell, and could hardly be kept in a bedroom, but that was obviated, and the trade progressed to its present extent. The lucifer match boxes, the most frequent in the street trade, are bought by the poor persons selling them in the streets, at the manufacturers, or at oil shops, for a number of oil men buy largely of the manufacturers, and can supply the trade at the same rate as the manufacturer. The price is 2 1/4 pence, the dozen boxes, each box containing 150 matches. Some of the boxes, German-made, are round, and many used to be of tin, but these are rarely seen now. The prices are proportionate. The common price of a lucifer box in the streets is 1/2 pence, But many buyers, I am told, insist upon and obtain 3 a penny, which they do generally of someone who supplies them regularly. The trade is chiefly itinerant. One feeble old man gave me the following account of his customers. He had been in the employ of market gardeners, carmen, and others whose business necessitated the use of carts and horses. In his old age, he was unable to do any hard work. He was assisted, however, by his family, especially by one son living in the country. He had a room in the house of a daughter, who was a widow, but his children were only working people, with families, he said, and so he sold a few lucifers as a help, and to have the comfort of a bit of tobacco, and buy an old thing in the way of clothing without troubling anyone. Out of his earnings, too, he paid 6 a week for the schooling of one of his daughter's children.
"I sell these lucifers, sir,"
he said in answer to my inquiries.
"I never beg with them. I'd scorn it. My children helped me, as I've told you. I did my best for them when I was able, and so I've just a sort of claim on them. Well, indeed, then, sir, as you ask me, if I had only myself to depend on, why, I couldn't live. I must beg or go into the house, and I don't know which I should take to worst at 72. I've been selling lucifers about 5 years, for I was worn out with hard work and rheumatics when I was 65, 66. I go regular rounds, about 2 miles in a day, or 2.5, or if it's fine, 3 miles or more from where I live, and the same distance back, for I can sometimes walk, middling if I can do nothing else. I carry my boxes tied up in an handkerchief, and hold 2 or 3 in my hand. I'm ashamed to hold them out on any rail where I ain't known, and never do if there isn't a good-humoured looking person to be seen below, or through the kitchen window. But my eyesight ain't good, and I make mistakes and get snapped up very short at times. Yesterday, now, I was lucky in my small way. There's a gentleman that if I can see him, I can always sell boxes to at 1 pence apiece. That's his price, he says, and he takes no change if I offer it. I saw him yesterday at his own door, and says he,
"Well, old greybeard, I haven't seen you for a long time. Here's 1 shilling. Leave a dozen boxes."
I told him I'd only 11 left, but he said,
"Oh, it's all the same."
And he told the boy that was crossing the hall to take them into the kitchen, and we soon could hear the housekeeper grumbling quite loud, perhaps she didn't know her master could hear, about being bothered with rubbish that people tuck in master with, and the gentleman shouts out,
"Some of you stop that old mouth, will you? She wants a profit out of them in her bills."
All was quiet then, and he says to me quite friendly,
"If she wasn't the best cook in London, I'd have quitted her long since, by God." The old man chuckled no little as he related this. He then went on,
"He's a swearing man, but a good man, I'm sure, and I don't know why he's so kind to me. Perhaps he is to others. I'm ashamed to hold me boxes to the rails, 'cause so many does that to beg. I sell lucifers both to mistresses and maids. Some will have 3 for a penny, and though it's a poor profit, I do it, for they say, 'Oh, if you come this way constant, we'll buy of you whenever we want. If you won't give 3 a penny, there's plenty will.' I sell, too, in some small streets, Lisson Grove way, to women that see me from their windows and come down to the door. They're needle-workers, I think. They sometimes say, 'I'm glad I've seen you, for it saves me the trouble of running out.' Well, sir, I'm sure I hardly know how many boxes I sell. On a middling good day, I sell 2 dozen. On a good day, 3 dozen. On a bad day, not a dozen. Sometimes not half a dozen, and sometimes, but not often, not more than a couple. Then in bad weather, I don't go out, and time hangs very heavy if it isn't a Monday. For every Monday, I buy a 3-penny paper of a newsman for 2 pence, and read it as well as I can, with my old eyes and glasses, and get my daughter to read a bit to me in the evening. The next day, I send the paper to my son in the country, and so save him buying one. As well as I can tell, I sell about 9 dozen boxes a week, 1 week with another, and clear from 2 shillings to 2 shillings 6 pence. It's employment for me, as well as a help.
It is not easy to estimate the precise number of persons who really sell lucifer matches as a means of subsistence, or as a principal means. There are many, especially girls and women, the majority being Irish women, who do not directly solicit charity, and do not even say, "Buy a box of lucifers from a poor creature to get her a ha'porth of bread," or "Please a bit of broken victuals, if it's only cold potatoes, for a box of the best lucifers." Yet these match-sellers look so imploringly down an area or through a window, some shouldering a young child the while, and remain there so pertinaciously that a box is bought or a halfpenny given, often merely to get rid of the applicant. An intelligent man, a street seller, and familiar with street trading generally, whom I questioned on the subject, said,
"It's really hard to tell, sir, but I should calculate this way. It's the real sellers you ask about, them as tries to live on the selling lucifers, or as their main support. I have worked London and the outside places, yes, I mean the suburbs, in 10 rounds, or districts, but 6 is better, for you can then go the same round the same day next week, and so get known. The real sellers, in my opinion, is old men and women out of employ or past work, and to beg they are ashamed. I've read the Bible, you see, sir, though I've had too much to do with jolly persons even to go to church. I should say that in each of those 10 rounds, or at any rate, splicing one with another, was 20 persons really selling lucifers. Yes, and depending a good deal upon them, for they're an easy carriage for an infirm body, and as ready a sail as most things. I don't reckon them as begs, or wines, or sticks to an house for an hour, but them as sells. In my opinion, they're 200, and no more. All the others dodge us in one way or another, on pity and charity. There's one lurk that's getting common now. A man, well-dressed and very clean, and wearing gloves, knocks at a door, and asks to speak to the master or mistress. If he succeeds, he looks about him, as if he was ashamed, and then he pulls out of his coat pocket a lucifer box or two, and asks, as a favour, to be allowed to sell one, as reduced circumstances drive him to do so. He doesn't beg, but I don't reckon him a seller, for he has always some story or other to tell. That's all a fakement.
Most dwellers in a suburb will have met with one of these well-dressed match-sellers. Adopting my informant's calculation and supposing that each of these traders take, on lucifers alone, but 4 shillings weekly, selling 9 dozen, with a profit to the seller of from 1 shilling 9 pence to 2 shillings 6 pence, we find £2,080 expended in this way. The matches are sold also at stalls, with other articles, in the street markets and elsewhere. But this traffic, I am told, becomes smaller and only amounts to 1/10 of the amount I have specified as taken by itinerants. These street sellers reside in all parts of town which I have before specified as the quarters of the poor.